Hey there folks, the number one Kamasi Washington fan from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Kamasi Washington record, Fearless Movement. Kamasi Washington is arguably the single biggest solo force in jazz today, one of the biggest band leaders without question. At the very least, Kamasi Washington is tied with the likes of The Comet Is Coming and Bad Bad Not Good in ensuring that jazz manages to continue to reach a wider audience beyond the initial jazz community. And I feel that's especially important in the present moment because I would honestly argue that there's a sort of renaissance of experimental, boundary-pushing jazz going on right now across the entire planet. And people like Kamasi Washington just so happen to be at the forefront of it. Compared to some of his more boundary-pushing peers, however, I think that there is an argument to be made that Kamasi Washington is, to an extent, one of the more archetypal examples of a jazz musician right now managing to make notable waves beyond the initial jazz-leaning, jazz-listening community. I mean, he doesn't go around spouting the same jazz stopped growing after 1965 mentality that people like Wynton Marsalis, for example, do, and he has constantly experimented with various other subgenres, ensuring that he's pretty easily classifiable as jazz fusion, whether you want to talk about his experiments with funk, R&B, or even rap kind of influences at times. However, records like The Epic are phenomenal because of the fact that they go forth with the idea of managing to create something beautiful out of restraint within the context of ideas that have already been presented in a genre's history, rather than trying to rebrand the entire genre itself. And that's not a knock against Kamasi Washington, because he easily is one of the greats of modern jazz. But with that in mind, it's also somewhat understandable that someone looking for something that just completely destroys any notion, any preconceived ideas of what jazz can be, would maybe not be so much into his past work, or at least not as into it as his popularity would make it seem, and as far as, you know, his love within the jazz community goes. Now, Fearless Movement could be argued, could be cited, as having a relatively similar place within jazz at the moment, because on one hand, this is a record that does a lot of things that you can honestly probably find in a variety of other jazz artists, a variety of other jazz projects out there across the planet right now, but at the same time, it does kind of feel like one of the most daring works that Kamasi Washington has ever been involved with from a creative standpoint, for better or for worse at times. I mainly say this because there are a number of different creative directions that Washington brings up here as newfound influences that we either have never seen before from him or have seen before, but never to this extent exactly, because while many of the sounds found on Fearless Movement can be directly traced back to some of his past releases, some of the work that he's done with various other artists in the past, I would argue that there are a number of moments here that really push things to his own personal extremes in a way that I don't think we've ever really gotten, at least not on an album with him as a bandleader in the past. This becomes pretty obvious within the first few songs on this 12-song record here, with the album's second full-length track on it, Asha the First, featuring Taj as well as Ras Austin, the sons of legendary West Coast rapper Ras Kass, with a sort of classic block party raps vibe going on. It's hard to directly compare it to any artist or album without having to name off an entire time period, but it definitely does capture the kind of high energy fun that sort of early DJ Kool Herc, Cindy Campbell era of non-recorded rap kind of had many decades ago at this point. And I think it's an interesting take on that kind of sound because it manages to feel intentionally fun and silly, yet at the same time it manages to also feel completely out of place on the record, considering it's an album that never really returns to that sound exactly throughout the rest of its runtime. But as it stands, I think it's a pretty interesting take on that sound. I do kind of wish that maybe that was done a little bit more often, the idea of capturing that like classic live block party sort of energy in the context of a record. But then again, I feel like that's kind of the point of the track, is to feel completely individualistic and transition into a lot of the more celebratory moments that you get later in the record. So very interesting experimentation from Kamasi Washington there in that regard, as far as taking up new influences. It just feels kind of oddly placed in the context of the album, but nonetheless, it is an example of how he is taking Fearless Movement as an opportunity to expand his sonic palette and to go in new directions as a band leader, and I definitely admire that creatively. You also have the following track, Computer Love, which is a fairly interesting cover of a 1986 classic from the ever-influential synth funk band Zapp, and that isn't to mention the fact that the record also has the occasional appearance from musicians like D Smoke on the George Clinton jam track Get Lit, which actually sounds better in theory than it is in execution, but nonetheless, those two individuals are on that track. As well as this appearance from this super underground, new age flute guy that you've probably never heard of. He's called Andre 3000. I think he's kind of like on the up and coming right now. He's from like some country called Stankonia. He does alright here. Kind of an interesting dude. In this way, I will say I do think that Fearless Movement manages to be a pretty distinct record from a lot of Washington's past efforts. Now, do I think that this is his big shape of jazz to come, wildly avant-garde moment or anything like that? That moment where he just breaks any and all preconceived ideas of what he could or would put out as far as full-length albums go? No, not at all, not at all. I don't think this is a record that makes you question what jazz can be, or what does it mean to make music, etc., etc. But at the same time, it's quite adventurous by its own standards, and I really do think that as far as taking up new ideas, presenting a variety of concepts in the context of the same record, while also ensuring that they bleed together reasonably well, I think that this may honestly be the single most experimental Kamasi Washington record to date from that regard, even if I do think that some of his past records are generally more successful in creating an overall atmosphere, managing to feel more well composed from track to track, etc., etc. So yeah, if you're looking for something completely different, something that will just shatter any idea of, what jazz is to you in your head, then you're probably not going to find much here. I'll be completely honest with you. Well, with that in mind, Fearless Movement, it does feel like a welcome step in a variety of different directions for Kamasi Washington, and I think if you walk into this record expecting it to not be experimental on the grounds of jazz, but rather on the grounds of Washington's discography, you'll find something that's actually surprisingly unique. And that's not to mention that Washington himself does perform excellently here, though that probably comes to the surprise of no one. I mean, if you are watching this video, chances are you are familiarized with Kamasi Washington and his style of playing, his performance style, and I mean, it's not that shocking for me to say, hey, this guy's talented. I'm sure that you are well aware of that as the viewer, but even excluding his talent as a band leader, as a leading figure in a group of musicians, Kamasi Washington has genuinely, undoubtedly proven himself to be one of the most technically and emotionally impressive saxophonists of recent years, and I mean, hey, Fearless Movement is an undeniable continuation of those same credentials that he's pretty much proven time and time again over the course of the past decade or so. I mean, whether you're going for a more hypnotic performance from him, like on the Andre 3K collab Dream State, or something more subtly harsh with tracks like The Garden Path, for example, Fearless Movement is pretty much unsurprisingly a means for Washington to show off his general abilities as a saxophonist, as a performer, as he takes center stage as a performer above all else here, which is kind of an issue I have with this record, but I'll get to that in a moment. I think my favorite example of Washington's actual performance work as a solo performer on this record actually comes at the tail end of the record with the track Prologue, a sort of reinvention of a very originally brief Astor Piazzolla composition that is extremely expanded upon here, turned into a wildly different piece altogether in a way that I think is just interesting conceptually, and in terms of execution is absolutely phenomenal, as it comes across as this celebratory, triumphant ending to a record that's generally speaking extremely upbeat in nature, even during its more laid-back moments, and also slightly related, that song was chosen as the lead single for this album back in the beginning of March of this year, if I'm not mistaken, and that's just a bizarre choice. The last track on the album being the single, that's just weird, but that doesn't take away from the album. I just felt the need to point that out. I digress. Kamasi Washington, he's a dynamic performer, and he's unquestionably one of the modern saxophonists that I think could most closely be defined as virtuosic, if you want to use terms like that. I mean, all of his skill, his talent, his completely unrestrained passion behind the sax, it's all on display here, and if you're looking, again, for something that's providing his abilities in a way that is completely different from his past records, I don't know if you'll find what you're looking for here, to be completely honest, but if you're just looking for another incredibly impressive performance from Kamasi Washington, a guy who is known for being one of the most impassioned performers out there in jazz active today, then you will absolutely find that here on Fearless Movement, a record that is bold in that regard as well. Now, with that being said, I did mention that I had a slight qualm with the amount of center attention that Kamasi Washington himself takes up here, and I will say, first and foremost, it makes sense. This is a Kamasi Washington album. It's not like it was called, by the Kamasi Washington Project or the Kamasi Washington Band. It's the guy, and nothing else attached to this album in the most literal sense, even if there are a plethora of other musicians here. But even still, I feel like jazz, being such a collaborative genre in nature, I kind of wish that there was more of a highlight spot for some of the other performers here, most of which are extraordinarily talented and do occasionally shine in a way that kind of leaves me yearning for more. I mean, there are genuinely a handful of moments here where the sidemen on this record do get the chance to kind of show off their own respective abilities, which are often kind of equal to their band leader here, in a way that I would kind of say is surprising, not necessarily due to their lack of perceived talent or anything like that, but just because of the fact that I don't really expect those highlights to happen, and again, when they do, they kind of leave me wanting more. For example, you have Woody Applenaup's guitar work throughout the track Road to Self KO, which is distorted in a way that intentionally plays against the smoothness of the track that I can only really describe as comparable to some select John McLaughlin-led Mahavishnu orchestra cuts, and even then I feel like that's absolutely a stretch, as I think the guitar tone on Road to Self is this sort of deep, not quite warm, yet not cold either, just this very middle of the road in a good way tone that adds an extra level of texture that I would have never expected from that track, and I think it ultimately greatly benefits it in the end and makes that passage one of the highlight moments of the entirety of Fearless Movement. Elsewhere, you have individuals like the iconic bassist and ex-Suicidal Tendencies member Thundercat, you have trombonist Ryan Porter, you have pianist Cameron Graves, you even have key player Brandon Coleman taking on these various different roles that range in importance from track to track, from song to song. Their placement on the album ranges from a couple of tracks in the case of Thundercat to the whole damn thing in the case of Coleman, etc., etc. It's just a slurry of musicians that all manage to be extremely talented individuals who are essential to the creation of this record, of course, because at the end of the day, any album that's based around having a large group of musicians, every single performer is going to be essential to some degree, if the record is based around textures, at least in the same way this one is. But at the same time, I kind of wish that each of them got the spotlight a little bit more rather than just kind of playing a backseat role, because really I feel like there is a ton of untapped talent that's directly present on this record. So yeah, perhaps it would have been nice to get one or two more solos from really any of the aforementioned performers that act as sidemen throughout the entirety of Fearless Movement, rather than just having Kamasi Washington himself pretty much take up the majority of the runtime in terms of highlighting individual instrumentalists. But with that being said, that doesn't inherently mean that the other performers here don't get any opportunity to shine. It just means that you kind of have to have your active listening present to really appreciate every individual that's being put into play here. But then again, you could also say that about really any album, so do with that information what you will. If you are just desperate to hear the next steps in the development of jazz as a genre of music, you're probably not going to find it here, I'll be completely honest with you, but if you are equally concerned about the next steps in Kamasi Washington's career, then, I mean, obviously, you'll find that here, as this really does feel like a more than strong listening experience that demonstrates growth from him both as a saxophonist and as a bandleader. I mean, perhaps things could have been tidied up to some degree with the lack of individual instrumentalists being highlighted beyond Washington himself really being one of the only major strikes that this record has going against it in my eyes. But small qualms, or at least relatively small qualms like those aside, some of the most adventurous material that Kamasi Washington has ever put out can be found here, and even if the execution feels a touch messy, a touch lacking at times in through experimentation when compared to some of the other stuff being put out there right now by active jazz artists and projects, I do think that the end result of this record ends up being quite impressive, even if I am ultimately going to return to some of his other records when I feel the need for that Kamasi Washington fix. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. Thank you for watching The Infinite Jukebox, and I'll see you in the next one.